Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Medtech Impact Podcast, where you get to hear from leaders and innovators who are shaping the future of medical technology. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Meiklejohn.
And we're your hosts of the show.
So today on the Medtech Impact Podcast, we're delighted to be joined by Ben Holmes, CEO and co-founder of Nanochon. Ben, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, pleasure to be here.
Hey, Ben, well, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on. We're recording this just ahead of Christmas. This is one of our last recordings before the end of the year. And just delighted to have you on because we were catching up before this. You were saying it's been a while since we caught up and a lot of exciting stuff has been happening. So looking forward to diving into some of that. Before we do that, we want to dive in for the audience and set the stage. So what is that big problem that Nanochon is looking to solve?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. So we are really laser focused on treating one of the biggest problems in orthopedics today, and that is treating cartilage damage and loss in the knee. We are specifically looking at what we're defining as the pre-knee replacement population. So these are not people in their 70s or 80s who have severe joint disease and are just going to get routed into getting a knee replacement as the sort of tried and true treatment. We're really focused on, anywhere from a young athlete in their 20s that's torn something on the field all the way up to somebody who's in their 50s or 60s who is starting to develop that moderate arthritis, but for one reason or another is not yet an ideal candidate to receive a joint replacement.
So just a small problem there. I mean, I think of this almost like the holy grail of orthopedics. It's like, wow, the ability to address something like that is so significant. And people are living longer, as you point out, in terms of like that big aging population to address there. But what are you seeing in terms of those numbers for that younger group that you're targeting, and the sort of volume of injuries that are arising?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's roughly 700,000 knee arthroscopies performed every year in the U.S., and a large majority of those are to repair cartilage defects. So we believe that we could address probably 500,000 or close to 500,000 of those 700,000 patients annually. And the big challenge that anybody in this category is facing is that cartilage is a very slow progressing disease in terms of osteoarthritis. And a lot of the time people will sustain these traumatic injuries in their 20s or maybe in their 30s. They have some corrective procedures, but that trauma and that experience of injury actually jumpstarts this osteoarthritic degeneration. And so even if somebody has something like an ACL tear or something wrong with their meniscus, they get it repaired, and then 5 to 10 years later, they have a return to pain, they go back to the doctor, and then they've developed this moderate cartilage degeneration on what's called the articular surface. So basically what is the low friction gliding surface in the knee. And once that starts, there's really nothing that can be done from, I guess what I would say, like a palliative perspective, right? I mean, physical therapy, lifestyle changes, exercising is not going to correct this. And even things like injections, anti-inflammatories, it's too late for those things to really have an impact either. So these are patients that are in a lot of pain. They're, losing quality of life. It's impacting their day to day, and they need a significant treatment. But there's just really nothing that's good for the patient today. So really it's sort of, there's a couple buckets. There are these purely surgical techniques where the surgeon essentially just goes in and kind of cleans out the damaged cartilage and maybe does something to stimulate the bone underneath to hopefully get something to regrow, but that doesn't actually regrow real durable cartilage. It essentially grows a scar tissue. So the big problem with that is that it's an easy procedure to do for the surgeon, and the patient does have some relief, but usually within 2 years, there's a return to pain and they have to go in for a revision surgery now. And the real challenge at this point, and this is really where Nanochon sees our device making a big impact, is that you can't just do that sort of simple debridement procedure again, because things continue to break down in the joint. So, they've had this type of procedure, they come back a couple of years later and the cartilage defect maybe has gotten bigger. The bone itself has also started to degenerate and wear away or change. And so something more robust has to be done. And there just really are not good, robust options, certainly for these patients that need revisions, but But what we want to do is offer something that can completely replace this debridement procedure as well. Something that surgeons can have a lot of confidence in. It's fast, it's easy to do, it's easy for them to access, and then it's something that's going to provide real longevity for their patients. So not only can you significantly delay the knee replacement later on in life, but maybe you can negate the need for it altogether. So that's ultimately the big moonshot goal of Nanochon. We want to make the knee replacement obsolete, but in order to do that, you got to treat these patients earlier, when they're younger, when the disease is just starting to progress.
You know, Cal, Ben mentioned this word trauma in terms of having a traumatic injury, but if you've ever seen a knee replacement, it's pretty traumatic in terms of like that process and like just how the people are getting in there with hammer and chisel, and it's a pretty invasive process. And I know Ben's talking about less invasive processes, but really they have some traumatic impact on patients. The fact that these can be debilitating diseases that worsen over time. So the fact that Ben's talking about something here that whether you're an athlete or again somebody's had an injury, who just enjoys an active lifestyle, it's so important that we remain fit and healthy and have that ability to move around.
Oh my gosh, I completely agree. And I was really fascinated by the fact that, with all of these sports injuries and it happening to patients younger, right? And that there is that window of time where you can't get a knee replacement. I mean, I remember I just recently, my colleague, all right, at Global Interconnect here, he's actually, I think he is in, oh gosh, he might kill me if he listens to this podcast, but I'm pretty sure he's a very young guy. He's definitely in his 50s, okay? Very young guy. But I remember, like, it took a long time to get that approval for a knee replacement, and there was no kind of middle ground solution. Like, he was in dire need of a knee replacement. And to your point, Richard, a knee replacement is quite a significant procedure. I mean, I saw the scar on his leg. Now, he seems to be doing all right, but boy, what an intense, procedure to have done. And yeah, if there's something, that middle ground, to treat these patients, obviously that's really exciting. And Ben, I think that it's fascinating how there's really nothing out there today where it's not just fixing and treating the cartilage, but it's giving the cartilage an opportunity to strengthen and almost grow back, right? And it sounds like that's what Nanochon is doing. So please tell us a little bit more about the technology that you're now bringing to market that will help really fill that gap and solve those problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's nothing I love more than talking about the technology. So thank you. We've essentially developed a simple to implant device, which is designed to go into the joint and just fill in the damaged areas of bone and cartilage. So it's a plug, essentially something that you can think of roughly the size of a coin. We're going to have a couple off-the-shelf sizes, and then it has a thickness which is designed to match the thickness of human cartilage. And then also it does go a little bit into the bone underneath. But a relatively small device compared to the size and invasiveness of a knee replacement, right? So designed to just repair those damaged areas. Can be done in a quick outpatient setting, can be done arthroscopically as well. So it's a minimally invasive procedure potentially. And the underlying technology that's enabling this product, it's really based on two key components. The first is the material itself. So we actually developed a synthetic material that mimics the properties of cartilage. So it's a totally artificially created polymer, but it has a highly aligned nanostructure that actually mimics the collagen bundles that exist in cartilage. So this is primary protein structure in the tissue. And that gives the material cartilage matched mechanical properties. So it does actually act in the short term as a replacement. So that means that patients can actually start rehab and start walking and moving around immediately, rather than waiting weeks or months to even start the rehab procedure. So that in alone is a huge benefit. But then the other element of our device is advanced manufacturing. So instead of this just being, a piece of our material that's machined or injection molded, we actually use 3D printing to take the material and make a complex structure. And so this is, in the scientific community, this is referred to as a scaffold, but it's basically a complex, well-organized structure that the body really likes to grow into. So you've got this three-dimensional pore structure. Immediately upon implantation, that structure allows for blood and primarily stem cells from the bone underneath to come up into the device. And then the material kind of takes over and actually supports the growth of those stem cells And the fact that the material has this structure that is essentially appropriate for cartilage directs those cells to then actually regrow healthy cartilage. And we've shown this now in a number of different experiments, and we're really excited because we're at the point now where we're getting ready to start our first human trial.
Well, that's fascinating to me, and I think what I'm really fascinated about is the synthetic material that you're using that stimulates that stem cell growth or the cartilage growth, right? So is that at all, could it ever be considered also a drug? I know it's a device, and I know that could be like a foolish question, but is there a drug aspect to the
So
device?
luckily in our case, there isn't a drug aspect
Okay.
because
Yeah.
this material isn't eluting anything. There's no drugs in it. There's no drugs coated on it. It really is just the structure of the material that interacts with the cells in this way. So that's very firmly puts us
Yeah.
in the device category from the FDA's perspective.
And I think I think it's fascinating your approach for 3D printed. Is it because are you trying to also be able to almost make this, you said off the shelf, right? You want to make these off the
Mhm.
shelf. Now, I don't see 3D printed off the shelf products being very scalable. But maybe that's my misunderstanding of today's 3D printing technology. But when I do think of 3D printing too, I think about the ability now to make something tailored and customized to someone's anatomy, right? The body, and what their knee is shaped like or what have you. So, tell us a little bit more about the 3D printed side.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'll kind of answer your first question about scalability.
Cool.
I think that when people think of 3D printed devices, they think of things that are made of metal or ceramic. And there are a lot of things that are done in the realm of custom, whether it is joint replacement technologies that are fully custom, or there's a lot of work that's done in cranio and maxillofacial and dental, where there are these, custom printed metal plates or backers or things. But in our case, we're actually using 3D printing technology, which is referred to as fused deposition modeling (FDM). And FDM is the most low-cost, accessible type of 3D printing. And for anyone who's not well versed in 3D printed manufacturing, this is essentially the same type of technology that's in like a MakerBot or essentially a hobbyist printer. We have higher quality production focused machines, but it's the same technology. Essentially, just a robot head moves around in space and deposits hot plastic in the shape that you want, and builds the part up. That's very accessible. It actually is very scalable, and we've done a lot of work over the last couple of years to do some manufacturing studies. And it's also an easy lift from a quality perspective. One thing that people that aren't super well versed in medical device manufacturing might not realize is that those laser-based systems that print metal or ceramics, basically they kind of like roll out powder, and a laser burns the material together, and then it rolls out another sheet of this powder. So when it's done printing, you usually have like a 1.5 by 1.5 cube of just powder with your part like kind of floating in the powder. And that's really expensive to validate from a medical device perspective, because you have to basically show that you can free all the powder and you can wash the part. And then you're also probably dealing with something that has complicated internal architecture that's like trapping a bunch of powder. So that's been like actually a huge challenge with that type of printing for a long time. But in our case, you're just basically building the part in air. And then when you're done printing, you just pop the part off. You might have to trim some little pieces of flash or something, but nothing that's more complicated than what you do with injection molding. So it's certainly not as scalable as just injection molding something. So if we were making like catheters or something where we want to make like millions a year and they're going to sell for like $5 a unit, 3D printing probably wouldn't be the best way to do it. But in our case, it's a market with a bigger price point
Yeah.
for a device, and also just friendlier margins in general. So when you kind of
Well,
look at
you think
our
about
models,
that.
it's achievable. Yeah.
Yeah, and when you think about that, it's a really good point, right? Because you know, a catheter someone also needs probably right now. And
Yeah.
you go in and yeah, okay, so you're experiencing knee pain, you've got these challenges with your knee cartilage or what have you. It's not, you have the time to like find the appropriate solution, and it's
Hmm.
not a life or death situation there either. And to your point, this is something that's going to go into your body and be there and make an impact for the rest of your life, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
there's no need to rush the process there. So this is all very fascinating stuff because I guess, Richard, based on the current standard of care and how Ben and his team are really doing something that's like absolutely mind blowing, super innovative. I think about now the response Ben's probably going to get from these doctors, right? And what that looks like as he approaches the market and introduces his technology.
Yeah, honestly, like you guys discussing there, my mind is brimming with questions, Ben, because it's just so many things you could do with the technology. I mean, the business model to me is fascinating in itself because the fact that you can almost turn the supply chain upside down and just have this just-in-time, custom fit, the whole economics, as you touched on there, just, is totally changed in terms of like you've got something that's truly customized, potential big time savings, obviously big cost savings, in terms of like the outputs of that, as well as just the whole process of planning and prepping for that to be done. There could be a lot of automation put in place there with that type of approach.
Yeah, I really appreciate those comments. And, I'll say too, one of the things that you mentioned, Kyle, was the ability for surgeons to wrap their head around this and, the ability to really drive physician adoption. Since the beginning of the company, we've spent a lot of time talking to surgeons, and we're a big believer in active customer discovery. So to date, we've probably talked to close to 300 surgeons about our product and gotten a tremendous amount of feedback. And this idea of custom or just in time or improving sort of the procurement workflow is something we've also really sought to maximize. I will say that today we are not planning on offering this as a patient specific device. And that actually was a very critical early learning, because our original assumption was that we would offer this as a patient specific device. And that's something that knee replacement surgeons will talk about there being potential value there, because if you're doing something really big and invasive like a knee replacement, mechanical alignment of the joint is really important. And so a custom implant can potentially solve those issues of adjusting to a patient's anatomy or their gait or the proper alignment. But in our case, we're talking about these younger patients, and it's a device that's designed to just fill the spots of damage. And the sports medicine surgeon said, hey, there's really no value to us for a custom device. I mean, we're really going in and just filling these spots. It's relatively easy to match the anatomy if you're talking about a confined area of the joint. And if it's something that's kind of regrowing tissue and it's going to fill in to a proper anatomical shape anyway, having a custom device right out the gate is not really important. What they really care most about is just having something they can stock on the shelves. That's really been the biggest pain point for these sports medicine surgeons that are treating the younger patient, because the standard of care today is still cadaver tissue. So they actually source bone and cartilage graft from an organ donor, like you would get a heart transplant or something. And they're trying to shape these grafts and plug them into the damaged areas of the living patient's joint. So that's not something they can really easily stock on their shelves. They can't just have like a cooler full of knees waiting to be used for this. And so they've got a very long, complicated process of procurement, authorization, and eventually coverage. So on average, patients wait around 6 months to receive an osteochondral allograft. And almost immediately when we started putting this in front of sports medicine folks, they jumped at that immediately. They were like, oh, this is something that could treat my large complex cases, but I can just have it off the shelf and I can pull it and use it as I want to use it. That's huge for them. It's huge. Wow. So we've really focused on building the product to maximize that. Now, what I will say is that the fact that we are a 3D printed device means for future applications of the technology, we absolutely could leverage patient-specific design where it's appropriate. And I think one example could be if we wanted to offer a new product that was designed to capture knee replacement patients, there could be value in doing a fully custom device. I also think there's other areas of the body outside of the joint, like the spine or like craniomaxillofacial surgery, where being able to do a fully custom workflow could really add a lot of value. And those are areas where custom devices are already being used. So it's also something that the providers and the users really understand. So not today, but a lot of opportunity in the future.
Could a doctor do anything? Could they modify your off the shelf solution to during that procedure to make it fit a certain way? Could they trim it a little bit, or is that a no-no?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that I think a really skilled surgeon could play around with. The way we've configured it now is it's essentially just a plug, and we develop like a drilling system. So the surgeon just goes in, they identify the defect, and then they just drill a hole through it and press our device into place. It's like really fast and easy. But
Wow.
there is probably, I would say maybe like 10 or 12% of our potential patients will probably be more complex cases that need some kind of a surgeon's additional touch to make sure that our device can appropriately treat them. And we have shown in our various labs and things that you can shape the device and cut it and trim it if you need to. So again, I'm going to say that might be something a little bit down the road. In our first trial, we want to be really straightforward and clean, but certainly I think there's the potential for a surgeon to play around and shape the graft and do something for a more complex case.
Totally fascinating, Ben. I mean, the potential for this, again, it's just so significant. I'm wondering when you're talking about, and the chondrograft, I think, is your technology, and all those conversations you've had, and you said those two magic words we love to hear, customer discovery. When you're getting feedback and thinking about current sort of emerging technologies like cell therapy, is there feedback on saying how this product could truly enhance cell therapy as well? Because right now they're maybe just injecting into a certain area, but what you're talking about is providing a scaffold which could really enhance that approach.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And it's funny because cell therapy is actually not necessarily new conceptually to this area. One of the biggest products on the market is actually a cell therapy product where they extract the cartilage cells from the patient, they culture them in a lab on a collagen membrane, and then that's implanted into the patient. But it's actually quite an old technology. It actually has been around since the 90s, and it kind of changed hands a few times and changed form factors as well. So it definitely has limitations. I do think that our implant could be a great adjunct to new and emerging cell therapies, especially as you talk about engineering cells or trying to genetically manipulate cells to be more potent. And then there's also been a huge adoption in, I would say, the kind of like pain management and non-surgical sector of sports, where clinics have actually set up these labs in their practices to, extract cellular material from the patient and then on site turn it into an injection or something. So I actually think that our device could be a perfect adjunct to something like that, where they're taking either like bone marrow cells or something else and turning them into a potentially bioactive injection. But Richard, you really hit the nail on the head there, which is that cell therapeutics still need something to keep them in place and support their continued development. And just injecting stem cells into the joint space or just trying to inject them into the defect, they're not going to stay there and they're just going to float away, or they're not going to progress down the right lineage to make cartilage. So yeah, I definitely think that a product like Nanochon could really have a powerful synergy with something like that.
Yeah,
But
it's so
again,
true,
that's not
but
what we're doing today. I
not
just want to
today.
be clear
But
about
again,
that.
it's
Not
kind of
today, but
interesting.
down the road.
Down the
Yeah,
road,
down the
exactly.
road.
But I've seen a couple of videos of Brian Johnson. He's a walking experiment. Pumping these stem cells into his various joints, and you're thinking, wow, these people are, it's the unknown. They're spending a lot of dollars doing this, and again, it seems again like you mentioned something for the future where this could be really complementary to that. So let's turn the corner now and think about where you are and that sort of road ahead. I'd love to know a little bit of the backdrop around. You've done some great sort of preclinical work, so maybe you could tell us a little bit more about those results and sort of lead us into sort of where you are today in terms of the clinical trial.
Yeah, absolutely. So any high risk medical device like us has to go through pretty rigorous animal studies before they can progress into humans. And it's also a great opportunity to, really stress test the technology, but also continue to refine the product, right? So when we started in 2016, we had a small grant to do a rodent study. So, I mean, that was the first time the technology, we were just taking it out of the lab, the academic lab. This is the first time it was ever even put in an animal. And that was the study where we really showed that this particular material we designed could actually support integration with the bone, which is really important for initial implantation, but then also support some regeneration of a cartilage-like tissue. So that's the first time we ever saw that. The next study we did was a pilot in goats. So goats and sheep are sort of the traditional animals that are used for knee preclinical studies. And that was the study where we really showed that this technology could regenerate a high-quality cartilage tissue. So that was a really important milestone for us. And then most recently, we did a horse study. So horses are an extremely rigorous model. They're not the typical model. I would say it's sort of considered like the Cadillac of preclinical studies for cartilage regeneration. But what's really important and what is really a benefit that you get out of doing a horse study versus these other more typical animals is that horses will actually develop osteoarthritis that looks very similar to how it progresses in humans. So when you do these studies, you have our treatment groups, and then you have a control group where we did that, essentially that kind of like debridement-like procedure that I mentioned at the top of the podcast. And we actually saw that in this horse study, that in the control groups, the tissue that grows is not cartilage, it's kind of a scar tissue, but also they start to show this osteoarthritic degeneration, especially in the subchondral bone, so the bone underneath the cartilage layer. And that's ultimately why this stuff fails in people. That's why they progress to needing knee replacements. And so this horse study not only confirmed that we see the high quality cartilage regrowth that we saw in that previous goat study, but it also showed that we effectively rehabilitate the bone as well, and have the capacity to stop that osteoarthritis. So that was incredibly exciting, really significant finding. And I would say also, very few horse studies have been done compared to all the other animals. The only product on the market that has horse data is that cell therapy product I talked about. So it's a really significant de-risking step, and just a really powerful demonstration of the potential in humans.
So really strong foundations there, Kyle. We're talking about all that physician feedback, talking about great clinical results. And now, Ben, as we're talking about before we came on here, you're now ramping up. I mean, you've had a fantastic year, been raising capital, getting great support. But now next year, you're going to be launching your clinical trials. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about, what's happening with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are pursuing a first-in-human clinical trial. This is going to be a 10-patient, what's called a safety study. So it's a small number of patients. First time it's being used in human beings, and the study is going to last 1 year. So the goal is to enroll 10 patients in the first half of next year, and then follow them out for 1 year after they're treated. We are a PMA device, so that means that we have to do larger randomized trials, sort of similar to a drug, in order to get FDA approval. So the hope is that with this strong first-in-human safety study, we'll be able to get approval to do the randomized trial. This will probably look like 200 or more patients, and that requires a 2-year follow-up. So if everything stays on track, we could be looking at FDA approval in late 2028 or early 2029.
Awesome. I mean, again, you've been on such an exciting trajectory. I think since we first connected a couple of years ago, and with Kyle and myself, it's exciting being watching from the sidelines all the progress you've been made. The programs you've been on, the awards you've been winning, and again, I think you had a recent move to a new space.
Yes. We're really excited about that. We just moved into a facility called the LaunchPort, which is up in Baltimore, Maryland. The LaunchPort is, I would say, a very unique and non-traditional incubator model. They focus only on medical devices. So they don't have like a bunch of biotech or pharma or diagnostics in there. It's all medical devices, all things that require extensive manufacturing. And what really attracted us to the space is they have an ISO certified FDA registered manufacturing facility that's attached to this larger incubator space. And so it's a place where we can move into and build our manufacturing process. And then when we're ready to utilize it, we can also, move things into this space that's appropriate for FDA compliant manufacturing. And that'll be really important for those larger clinical trials and also for go-to-market.
Well, the LaunchPort, Kyle, sounds like the perfect home for the Medtech missile. We need to go down and check that place out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're actually, both of us are going to have to go down there and maybe do a piece down there and highlight that facility. Ben, this is really neat. And, yeah, you've got somewhat of a long road, but boy, don't you have all your ducks in a row and you're well organized here. I'm curious, as while there's still maybe a few years to go before this actually is out and available on the market, what's the thought behind, reimbursement? How would that work with your technology?
Yeah, that's a really important question and something that we've also spent the last year and a half really digging into.
Hmm.
I think what's really nice about how we've designed this product is it's very analogous to the tools and the procedure that are used today to do those cadaver graft surgeries.
Hmm.
So essentially, conceptually, looks the same, except instead of plugging in a piece of cadaver tissue, you're plugging in our implant. And we were actually able to find historical precedent that the AMA ruled that the CPT codes that are used to cover the procedure to do osteochondral allograft could appropriately be applied to cover a similar procedure where a synthetic device was implanted. So that's very encouraging, because if you have to go into the market and then generate a totally new code, that basically starts up a whole long process of doing additional post-market clinical trials, gathering different types of data than you might gather for an FDA trial, and it's essentially an additional 5 to 6 year process after FDA approval
Hmm.
to generate that new code and get it applied to you. So we
Okay.
are delighted that there appears to be some strong backing and a good path to getting these existing codes. Now, we still are going to have to do some work. We're talking about designing economic endpoints that the payers care about into that randomized trial. And then also we'll probably have to do some additional post-market data collection, or maybe even some additional clinical work to really provide convincing evidence. But it's a much easier attainable process than trying to generate a new code. So
Yeah.
that was a really good finding, and something that also gives us confidence about the commercial opportunity.
Okay, yeah, I was just thinking too. There must be a side by side comparison element too. I mean, I'm sure you're going to want to compare your product to an actual tendon from a human body, right?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and there's a little bit of finessing here, because the
Yeah.
FDA cares about things that maybe the payers don't, or maybe they care about different things, right? So for the FDA, they still really want to see that debridement procedure as the control. So that's what we're planning on doing in our studies for FDA, right? Now, I think the question about what do payers care about gets a little bit more interesting, but luckily, those debridement and microfracture procedures, as I mentioned, they have pretty poor long-term outcomes, and the majority of patients need that revision within 2 years of the treatment. And so if you look at how payers view the market, especially if we're talking about patients that are still in the private payer system, I think the average amount of time that a given patient is in a given insurance network is 2 to 3 years. So the payers are well aware of the fact that they're initially paying for these debridement procedures up front, and then they're having to pay for a revision. So that's actually our plan, to really focus on the fact that this limits the need for those revisions in that 2 to 3 year time frame. And then the other element, which I think is very easy to understand for a payer and doesn't necessarily necessitate a lot of clinical evidence, is that those graft procedures and those cell therapies are very expensive, anywhere from $10,000 all the way up to sometimes $40,000 to $60,000, and that's just for the graft or the treatment. That's not for the procedure. So I mean, these procedures end up costing anywhere from $20-ish thousand dollars at kind of the low end, sometimes up to $100,000 for the whole procedure all in. And so we are bringing to market something that is an off-the-shelf device, low cost plastic, low cost, the most accessible low cost type of 3D printing you can do. So we can make these devices very affordable compared to those high price points for the therapies. And so I think that the 1-2 punch of this is that, yeah, I mean, we'll have good data to show you don't need that revision within that 3 year period, which is what they probably care about most.
Yeah.
But then also as an alternative to the grafting or the cell therapies, it's going to be so much less expensive, that it's just kind of a no-brainer. So I mean, that's really how we position it, certainly for the providers. but that also flows into what the payers are considering.
I think it fits so well with the sort of CMS desire to move towards more value-based care as well. If you think about this type of solution being at the first point more affordable, but equally, as you point out, less revisions, hopefully less risk of negative outcomes further down the pathway. You're talking about potentially shorter recovery time. It all fits together so nicely. Ben, you've got all these ducks in order, as Kyle said. What's coming up for you in the next sort of 6 to 18 months? If there's any call to action in terms of like the team or people you'd like to get involved, who would that be?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, not to sound like too much of a cliche, but medical device companies are always fundraising. So if you're an investor who's listening to this and might be interested in investing in us at some point, we're certainly looking at probably a fundraising opportunity in the second half of next year. So just would love to connect and get to know you. But the other more pressing thing is that with our move to this LaunchPort facility, we're also looking to expand our technical team and our technical staff. So I think that there's going to be, in the first half of this coming year, there's going to be some job opportunities for product design and manufacturing engineers in that Baltimore facility. So if you're a talented medical device manufacturing professional that's looking for a new opportunity, we'd love to talk.
Awesome.
Superb. Well, again, Kyle, I mean, what a story, in terms of like the potential impact of this and the trajectory that Ben's on. Ben, clearly people are wanting to get in touch with you. How do they do it? How do they find you?
Yeah, well, my email is very, very simple. It's just ben.holmes@nanochon.com. We're also active on LinkedIn, so you can reach out, to my LinkedIn profile with a direct message or to Nanochon's page as well.
Perfect. Well, this has been amazing. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, another huge thank you to Ben Holmes, CEO and co-founder of Nanochon, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Medtech Impact Podcast. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Meiklejohn. Until next time, keep innovating.